All right, I want to. There's some things I want to show you tonight, and they're here in the room. This is the room that we're in right now. I mean, that goes without saying again. But redundancy is not nefarious. Not necessarily nefarious. There's a lot of redundancy in song, for example, and in poetry. Refrains are often redundant. That's what they come back, and that is redundancy. But I mean, it's repetition. Now, what is redundancy? Redundancy is when you say more than is necessary to be that needs to be said. Now, in song, maybe you need to repeat things to make it be a song. You see, so it's not redundancy in a song. It's because it's not really it's not superfluity. It is certainly repetitiveness. Well, I have some things I want to show you. And this is going to be very interesting because you have probably never seen anything like this. Maybe. Norman O. Brown, who is a very special hero of mine, Nobby, he is called among his fellows, says in his book, one of my favorite books, called Closing Time. Now, that's a phrase. It's not a compound noun. It has no hyphen and doesn't deserve a hyphen. It's not closing time with a hyphen. It's closing time. That is to say, time as an object there. Well, in his book, Closing Time, he takes two books, puts two books on top of each other, and lets them have relations. That's pretty much his phrasing. He says, of course, by the way, it's impossible to put two books on top of each other. It's just physically impossible, but that's how we talk. Well, I have two books here that I have put on top of each other, and they have been they're standing now, but they're standing right next to each other because they have been bound together with a rubber band, I think. And I'm going to pull them out of I almost said briefcase. Now, bookshelf over here. It really is not a case. It's a brick and board shelving. Here we go. I think it's going to be fascinating. Which two books would you put on top of each other and let them have relations? What Nobby does in the book called Closing Time, the two books he chooses are, and this is very neatly appropriate, if that's not redundant, for today, because today is the 124th anniversary, if I've calculated correctly, and I have, I think, from 1882 to 1900 is 18 years, from 1900 to 2000 is 100 years, and from 2000 to 2006 is 6 years, so we have 100 plus 18 plus 6, 124 years since the birth of James Joyce. Okay, this is appropriate because we're talking about now the two books that Norman O. Brown, puts together in Closing Time. They are Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce's final masterpiece, and Giambattista Vico's book called La Nuova Scienza, or La Scienza Nuova, The New Science of Vico, V-I-C-O. And I don't claim to have read this book, and I haven't read all of Finnegan's Wake either. But Norman O. Brown synopsizes. He actually brings pieces from each of these books and juxtaposes them on his own pages and with a bunch of other stuff, and talks about how the world goes around and comes around. And he lays out pretty clearly Vico's understanding of a cyclical kind of process in human history, whereby we segue between and among a three-part cycle of ages of, how should we say, societal understanding. And we go from an age of gods to an age of, age of gods, age of heroes, age of men, something like that. I'd have to get the book, and that's not the one I wanted to show you. Okay, but so those are the two that Norman O. Brown puts together in Closing Time. Now, this is I am not making a book right now. We're making a videotape or whatever this is. But I have two books that I have juxtaposed in very much this way, but I haven't written the book yet that would correspond to Norman O. Brown's book called Closing Time about these two books. Look at these two books. I have read one of these books and I haven't read the other. Now, that's interesting, I think. And here they are. Here's the one on the front, okay? Look at that. That is a very important book, as so many of you realize. This is Jack Kerouac's On the Road. He comes from the east to the west, and you know what? I believe this, that when Kerouac and his buddies and then in this case Neil Cassidy mostly comes, but then Ginsberg and Corso all come. They come to the San Francisco Bay Area and other places in the West, and the whole thing shifts across the continent from New York City to San Francisco. Essentially, that's where it becomes centered. After On the Road, we get the Dharma Bums and so on. Okay, what's the other book that I have put on top of this one? See, there's Rubber Band here. They're together. This is a book I haven't read, but I have read the sequels, some of the sequels to this book. The hint is the picture of the author on the back. Well, in some sense, there's a picture of the author here, too. This representation of, what did he call himself? Sal Paradise, or whatever he called himself, Kerouac, in this novel. That's sort of intended to be a depiction of him on the cover. But this is a real photograph of the real author. Do you know who that is? Do you know who this is, John?
I do.
Hey, John knows who this is. This is J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of, and this is the book that I have juxtaposed with On the Road. It is indeed The Hobbit. Now, think about that. What do these two books entail and imply for the age of our culture? And I mean age in the sense of, is this the Iron Age, or the film age, or the video age? John would say it's the video age. I know that. John is a friend of mine. It's his camera that I'm looking at, speaking through, whatever we're doing here. So think about that. What do these two books have to say to each other? If they were isolated on a jungle, a desert island, a desert island, Mount Desert Island, or whatever you call that. What would they have to say to each other? That's an interesting question. I think any two books you could ask this question of any two books. Throw them both into the same trough and let them wallow together and see what comes out of it. What does it say? When you lie down with pigs, you stand up smelling like garbage? How does it go? Something like that. Or politics makes strange bedfellows. Something like that. Okay, well, that's all I had to say about these two books, but there are other books here around the shelves that we could talk about. Let me show you another one. This is very interesting. In fact, I came back with 3 books, which is reminiscent now of The Time Machine, of course. You remember the last scene of The Time Machine. In the movie, anyway, the question is, if you were leaving to live on a desert island, what 3 books would you take? I believe that's the question that Wells poses at the end of the story, The Time Machine, which I saw as a movie with Yvette Mimieux and Rod, whatever his name was. And I have 3 books here. These are not the ones I would necessarily take, but it just reminded me of that, which 3 books will you take? Some people would immediately say, oh, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Pearl of Great Price. They would say that because they're Mormons, or Mormons would say that, probably. Some kind of really devout religious Mormon would say, oh, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Pearl of Great Price. They would not have to think at all about which 3 books they would take. They would take the 3 books that are already right there at their bedside. Why would they take any others? They take the ones that they want to have with them all the time anyway. So, the Gideon or whatever. These are not necessarily those, although this one I think is so essential. I wish this is a biography. I think this is a critical biography. What's it called? A Romantic's Theory of Language and Poetry. This is about the great German poet Novalis, not his real name. It was a pseudonym. This young man died at the age of 30, I think, after having written some of the most amazing mystical poetry that has ever been written in any language that we know of. But, of course, there's a lot of untranslated stuff from weird languages. Well, he is an amazing man, Novalis is. He looks very young there because he never got old. He's the oldest of the 3 who I just reached out. No, he's not. There's one older one. This guy's older. Netzahualcoyotl was the king of Texcoco, an Aztec king, and he was the greatest poet of the Aztecs, and well known as that during his lifetime and even now. And I have translated a few short poems of his, which I don't have available right now. But this is a book about him in Spanish by a Mexican author, wouldn't you know, a man named Martinez. Nezahualcoyotl. I don't know what the first part of his name means, but the last part is coyote. That's a coyote at the end there. As in my own institutional use of the Aztec language in Quetzalcoyotl, the winged coyote. That was the name of my bookstore and art gallery in Missoula, and is the name of the burgeoning foundation or whatever it is that will have as its center something like a bardic academy, if you can imagine such a thing. Hey, just a minute, that reminds me of a fourth poet, and I better bring him in because he did found a bardic academy in Bolivia. I found this book for $1, remaindered on a cart out in front of Logos last year sometime, and I looked and I said, I never heard of this guy, and I read about his biography. He founded a bardic academy in Bolivia, and he was already a well-known poet in Bolivia when I was there in the '60s. But I wasn't able to go exploring in the underbelly of literary society of Bolivia because I wasn't living in cities. When I would be in wherever I was in La Paz or wherever so briefly, most of the time that I didn't have time to go exploring what literature was going on. Let's see if I can find this guy. There he is. I don't even remember his name, but look at this character. He is amazing. You ain't seen nothing yet. His name is Javier del Granado. He's probably no longer... He may still be just barely alive. I forget the dates. But he was a very serious poet in his younger years. This is probably from the 30s. I think he's in his 80s now. And on the back here he is. This is what happens if you're a mainstream... politically correct poet in a small Latin American country. This is who you become. We've never seen anything like this in the United States, but in Latin America, this is who you become. This would be the equivalent of what happens to, see who I think it would be. Oh, I don't know, but here he is. He's got all his medals. I think it's funny. He looks like he's been decorated. He's got, and this is a weird thing. I don't know what this means. Is Guy Saber? He's like a gay blade or something. At any rate, this guy, here's some of his poetry, all in Spanish. I may translate some of this. He's a little bit gushy, and he's very gushy about the landscape and the history of his native country. He intended to be a bard for his place, so he's singing the praises of his native land, and that's appropriate. But he's a little bit, we would call him square, I think. I would call him square. But he is. But he's probably, he's you know why I say this is because none of the anthologists of the 20th century ever picked up on him. Like he wasn't important enough internationally for anybody to care about him outside Bolivia, which leads me to believe that he wasn't even that important in Bolivia. For example, one of his contemporaries, somewhat younger but still active at the same time, a man closer to my own age, was Pedro Shimose, and I think he may still be alive. That's not a very Spanish-sounding name. The reason being, he is not of Spanish or Hispanic origin. He is actually of Okinawan origin and was born in an Okinawan colony in eastern Bolivia. Very interesting. Pedro Shimose is probably the most interesting late 20th century poet of Bolivia. Well, now here we've come to the great man himself. This book was sent to me by my good friend Harry Northup, my friend the actor-poet, down in Los Angeles, because he knows how much I love Edward Dorn. And when he found out that Edward Dorn, when he got this issue of the Chicago Review, devoted most in 80% of it to Edward Dorn's work and commentary about him and so on, he sent me his copy. I think he got it and read it and then sent it to me. But this is a great thing to have. It's got an interview with Dorn and photographs. I turned automatically to one. Let's see. Here's a photograph of Ed Dorn with his beautiful second wife. His first wife was very beautiful, too. This is Jennifer Dorn. She was British. He met her when he was teaching at the University of Essex, I think. But, man, she's a knockout. Look at that. She is a beautiful, beautiful woman. And that's Ed Dorn. I think they're partying at their house or something. Maybe an art opening or something in Boulder. He taught at the University of Colorado until he got too sick to teach. I showed you that picture of him the other day, John. Remember that? That may still be in here. This is Harry sent me this postcard too. The same Harry Northup who sent me the book. Here's Ed Dorn in his. He's about a year from dying from liver cancer or something, some kind of cancer. This is an illustration on a postcard advertising his last book, Chemo Sabe. Chemotherapy. He kept his sense of humor. He was a very, very funny man when he wanted to be, or when he allowed himself to be. The second and last time I saw him was at a reading at Beyond Baroque in Venice, in the early 80s, and a number of my friends were there. In fact, I think Harry Northup was there, and I think his wife Holly was there. A number of people from the Los Angeles scene. And after he read a lot of funny things, he read a lot of poems from his book called Abhorrences, which is the book of poems that, and Hello La Jolla too. He went to a very funny streak, and they faulted him on this. My friend said, "Well, how come he's so funny? Why we wanted to hear some of those really serious poems about the Great Wild West and the Apaches who were treated badly and so on." Here's Dorn toking up, or probably maybe it's just a cigarette, among other people at some sort of a poets conclave. But he was a great man. I met him first at the Charles Olson conference at the University of Iowa in 1978, and never have I met a more kingly man, I think. I mean, just through and through, all in all, the man impressed me as somebody from, I mean, it was like time travel, as it were. Yeah, look at that face, man. That's amazing. This man was heavy into life. Well, he really was. Amazing man. He was Charles Olson's best boy, according to what Philip Whalen told me. One of the meetings I had with Philip Whalen, meeting is not the right word, conference, session, visits. They were visits, but since Philip Whalen was a Zen master to be, you know, he wasn't officially a Zen abbot yet. When I visited him, he was simply a Zen adept who lived in the apartment house next to the Zen Center on Page Street in San Francisco. Well, I visited him 3 times, I think, maybe 4, but I think only 3 times during the 1970s. Just went, knocked on his door and went and visited. We sat and had tea. One time I took Wang Shan, Skip. We went together, and that was we got the time that Skip and I went. I mean, first time I went by myself. Second time I went with Skip. Third time I went by myself. The second time, when Skip and I went to visit Whalen, 2 guys were leaving. Just as we arrived, 2 guys were leaving. And the 2 guys were Donald Allen, if you will, who did the anthology that was our Bible for poets of my generation, young poets of New American Poetry, 1945-1960, which I discovered in the Caltech Humanities Library in the spring of '61, when it was less than a year published. Donald M. Allen did that anthology. It was great. It showed us that there was more going on in U.S. poetry than what the Unis even knew about. I mean, it wasn't that they were trying to prevent students from knowing about what was happening in poetry in their own time. The professors themselves didn't know, because professors don't know what's happening in the coffee houses and in the streets. They simply don't. And they don't know what's happening in the little magazines, except in special cases where such a professor is tuned to that scene. But there's so much going on that the university don't know in every area, except maybe the hard sciences. But even there are independent scholars that are doing things that they don't publish in the magazines.